The walls of Nineveh crumbled like sand before a storm. Fire devoured the gleaming temples. The palaces crumbled to ash, and screams of terror echoed through the streets, once filled with arrogance and pride. The river, engulfed in fury, invaded the city, sweeping away bodies and ruins, taking with it the illusory glory of an empire believed to be eternal. The once mighty king slithered in the shadows, betrayed by his guards, unable to stop the apocalypse that crushed his crown. Only judgment remained. High on a hill, Nahum watched in silence. He had announced the end. His voice thundered like lightning in the sky. "Behold, I am against you, Nineveh. Your end has come." But no one believed. Now the city that mocked the Most High was unrecognizable, reduced to ruins by fire and covered by water. But what truly made Nineveh a target of divine judgment? What dark mystery supported its walls, hidden for generations in the city's depths? What was the secret buried in its foundations, so terrible that not even kings dared reveal it? Join us as we unravel the small but powerful book of the prophet Nahum, where the walls of Nineveh tremble, the cries of oppression echo, and God's justice is proclaimed without turning back. Prepare to discover the secret hidden beneath the ruins, the eternal reminder that no human arrogance can escape the Lord's judgment. Who is this man who speaks so loudly as if the wind itself gave him a voice? It is Nahum, the prophet of Elkos. They say he carries a word that is not his, but the Lord's. Thus begins the story of Nahum, whose name in Hebrew means comfort, or one who brings comfort. But the paradox is stark. A man called Comfort appears not to bring relief, but to announce judgment. Scripture gives us his origin, the judgment against Nineveh. The book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite, Nahum 1:1. We know nothing of his mother, siblings, or descendants, only the place, Elkos. Many scholars speculate that it was in the region of Judah, perhaps a small village lost among the hills, where the boy Nahum learned early to listen to the silence of the land and the strength of the wind blowing freely through the valleys. If his name is consolation, why does he talk about destruction? Asked an elderly man in the square. Because the consolation is not for the arrogant of Nineveh, but for the afflicted of Israel, who suffered under the Assyrian lash, answered another. With a grave look, the scene is now Nineveh itself, capital of the Assyrian Empire. A city that seemed invincible, with walls so thick that chariots ran side by side on them. Ivory palaces, hanging gardens, temples erected to strange gods, and streets teeming with merchants, soldiers, and foreigners. The sound of mingled languages echoed like a river. The wind, however, cut through the alleys and carried a different voice. A voice that belonged neither to a merchant nor to a soldier. It was Nahum. The prophet came not with sword or army, but with words that cut deeper than iron. His voice, firm and clear, seemed to come from within the very air currents that passed through the city. Nineveh, he proclaimed in the middle of the marketplace. He who formed the mountains and weighed the wind in his hands has risen up against you. The people laughed. Women pulled children along. Men clapped as if watching a show. The laughter, however, was short-lived. A sudden gust of wind blew, extinguishing torches and raising dust. The laughter turned to brief silence. Even the merchants stopped trading. "It's just a coincidence," one of the guards muttered, adjusting his spear. "Coincidence?" replied a visiting peasant. "That voice pierces my chest as if it were the wind itself speaking." Nineveh had heard of prophets before. Jonah, many years before, had walked those same streets proclaiming destruction. But this time, the entire city bowed, from the king to the animals. Now the city's heart was hardened. Centuries of power had blinded its eyes. He walked, and wherever he went, the wind seemed to obey. The flags fluttered, the palm leaves shook, and the flames wavered. Some whispered, "He speaks and nature responds." Or perhaps the Creator himself accompanies him. The prophet was not a man of long speeches. Each sentence was like thunder concentrated in a few words. The Lord is jealous and avenging. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries. His wrath is not delayed. The words echoed through the city's corridors like a whip against stone. And as he spoke, Nahum did not seem alone. Anyone watching him from afar would have sworn a column of air enveloped him, as if the heavens were bending down to amplify his denunciation. Some young people scoffed, "This madman speaks against walls that cannot be torn down, against kings who crush nations with a single gesture." But an old woman, her skin marked by time and her eyes sunken with memory, replied, "You are crazy. Have you ever seen the wind held by a man's hand? If the wind blows, no one can stop it, and that voice comes with it." Thus, Nineveh heard Nahum's oracle for the first time, an oracle that was not of blessing but of judgment. The wind became a messenger. Laughter turned to unease. The city, which had always prided itself on dominating everything, discovered it could not control the air. The climax of that afternoon was simple, yet profound. A gust of wind ripped through the square, knocking over tables, scattering fruit and coins, and causing the wealthy to trip over their own cloaks. A heavy silence fell, and in that pause, only one voice remained firm. "Thus says the Lord, though you rage like a storm, you will be swept away like chaff." The torches, previously extinguished by the wind, flared up again. But the listeners' eyes no longer shone with laughter. They were filled with something many dared not admit: fear. Nahum gathered up his cloak, gazed at the walls that rose like stone giants, and murmured in a low, almost intimate, but still audible tone, "The wind will return. And when it returns, it will not only blow dust, but fire." A young man who had followed him from the gates swallowed hard and asked, "And when the wind returns, what will be left of us? Only what the Lord wants to save will remain. And if nothing remains, how can we live? Man does not live by what he keeps behind walls, but by what the Lord allows to remain." Nahum's words echoed as the gates of Nineveh slammed shut, creaking as if to test their strength. They were bronze gates, towering, decorated with reliefs of winged lions and bulls. Guards pounded their spears against the metal plates, sending the sound vibrating through the city's entrance. It was as if each slam said, "Nothing enters here without permission." Nineveh was proud of these walls. They were proof of its arrogance. No traveler arrived from far away without being impressed by their height. It was said that chariots could race side by side across their summit. For the inhabitants, it was more than just stone. It was a symbol of power, a shield against fear. "Look at these walls," a merchant shouted, displaying his wares. "As long as they're standing, no one can touch our houses." A young man replied, still with the memory of Nahum's voice in his mind, "But the wind did not respect the gates." The people laughed. But their laughter didn't last. A faint buzzing, almost like a whisper, traveled through the cracks in the walls. Some thought it was their imagination. Others looked up uneasily. In the watchtower, a sentry muttered to his colleague, "Do you feel that?" "What?" "That vibration," as if the stones were breathing. The guards pounded their spears harder against the bronze, trying to muffle their discomfort. But the echoing sound seemed to return an answer, a hollow, low rumble, as if something invisible was running through the foundations. Nahum raised his eyes to the walls. He had no sword, no troops, but his voice was firm. "The Lord is not astonished by bricks or bronze. He blows and dust returns to dust." Some scoffed, "Our king defeated entire peoples. Who can stand against us? Even Israel fell before our weapons." But others silently remembered ancient stories, how Babylon had risen and then faded. How once great kingdoms were now just memories in the desert dust. Nahum walked before the gates, each step seeming to defy the eyes of those who trusted in bronze. The wind accompanied him, stirring his cloak, bringing dust from the ground. The city that rises by pride will fall by the same pride. Suddenly, A strong gust ripped through the gates, producing a strange sound, a prolonged wail, as if the doors themselves were weeping. The guards' torches flickered. Silence fell heavily. An old beggar who used to sleep near the walls raised his weak voice. "I've heard that sound before. It was in my village, before the soldiers of Nineveh destroyed everything. The wind came first, and then came the fire." The people backed away from him, frightened, as if his words carried a curse. But the vibration in the stones did not cease. It was invisible, almost imperceptible, but real. The gates, the pride of the city, trembled silently, not as if about to fall, but as if awaiting a greater weight. A boy held his mother's hand and asked, "Mom, why are the walls angry?" The mother didn't answer. She just stared at the gates, as if looking at something that could collapse at any moment. Nahum, with his eyes fixed on the height of the stones, said in a grave tone, "Though you soar like the eagle, and your nest is among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord." The sentries looked at each other uncertainly. They struck their spears against the bronze again, but the sound that returned was louder than before. It sounded like a hidden roar. The sun was setting, dyeing the walls red. The wind blew through the gates, carrying dust and a sense of foreboding. Anyone who watched could have sworn the stones were vibrating like a restless heart. A merchant, trying to hide his fear, shouted, "They're just stones! No one can speak through them." But at that moment, the vibration ran like thunder contained by the walls, and everyone felt in their chest the weight of something they did not understand. Silence fell again, until a soldier, his voice breaking, asked, "If the gates that protect us are already shaking, what will become of us when the day of the Lord comes?" When that day comes, no gate will be able to remain standing. If no gate can stand, then where is Nineveh's strength? It is stained, hidden under stones and palaces. Whoever has eyes to see will see the blood that never dried. The market was bustling as always. Baskets of dates, sacks of wheat, jars of olive oil. Colorful fabrics swayed from the stalls, and merchants shouted their offerings. Those arriving from outside expected to find only wealth and abundance. But Nahum walked among the stalls, as if seeing another layer of the city, one that the ordinary eye cannot see. The stones on the ground shone in the sun, but the prophet seemed to hear what was engraved on them. The cries of defeated peoples, prisoners taken as slaves, blood spilled in the name of conquest. Nineveh, city of blood, he proclaimed loudly. Full of lies and robbery, robbery never departs from her. Some merchants glanced at each other. A priest, passing by in his white robe, quickly looked away. The discomfort spread like the wind. "Why does he talk like that?" a woman murmured, arranging fruit in the basket. "Because it touches the wound that cannot be healed," replied an elderly man, holding his granddaughter's arm. Nahum raised his hand and pointed to the crowded warehouses. "These barns are full, but they are not the fruit of righteousness. They are full of tears that have not been seen." An angry young man shouted, "Lie! Everything here comes from the strength of our king." "Strength?" Nahum replied firmly. "Strength that crushed orphans, that imprisoned the innocent, that silenced voices. It's not strength, it's guilt." The word echoed through the market, guilt. It was as if each syllable carried weight. Some stopped trading. Others, nervous, spoke quickly, trying to drown out the memory growing in their hearts. A priest, called to offer blessings at the temple, hesitated. His eyes lowered, his mouth dry. He knew the stories circulating in silence, tributes violently extracted, children taken as war booty, blood running down the palace steps. Nahum walked slowly, but his words were blades. "You can paint the columns gold, but the floor still screams. You can cover them with expensive carpets, but the blood will not be silenced." The silence was broken by a bolder merchant. "And your people, prophet, did they not also sin?" "Yes," Nahum replied without hesitation. "But the Lord disciplines his own." He will not leave unpunished those who are drunk on the pain of others. A murmur ran through the tents. Some remembered the battles that made Nineveh rich. Each victory was celebrated with feasts, but it always left a trail of death in distant lands. Now the memory returned like a ghost. In the temple tower the bell rang to summon the priests, but even the sound seemed heavy, as if it echoed within the word Nahum had just spoken: guilt. An old priest with trembling hands stood before the prophet. "What do you want from us, man of Elkos?" Nahum looked steadily. "It is not to me that you should answer, but to him who sees what they hide." The crowd stirred uneasily. Many averted their eyes, others backed away from the prophet, as if fleeing from fire. But there were also those who approached in silence, curious, fearful. The wind blew again, stirring up dust over the warehouses, and the dust seemed to mingle with the smell of the market, bringing with it the bitter memory of bloodshed. A child pulled at his mother's cloak and asked loudly, "Mom, why does the prophet speak of blood if I only see bread?" The mother fell silent. There was no simple answer. Nahum raised his voice again, and this time he spoke as if he were sentencing before an invisible tribunal. "Woe to the bloodthirsty city! Its treasures are a curse, its harvests are mourning, its walls hold unceasing screams." The crowd stood still. The silence weighed even more heavily. A young man with tears in his eyes whispered softly to the person next to him, "What if he's right? What will be left of us? Only the judgment that the Lord has already set for this place will remain." Before we continue, we ask for your support. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps us continue to bring powerful messages like that of Nahum, the prophet who announced that the seemingly invincible city would be reduced to ashes, and that the oppressed people would finally claim victory. Now let's move on to the fall of Nineveh, and the revelation that changes everything. So this is what the Lord has planned, that Nineveh, so full of riches, will be remembered only for its guilt. Riches do not hide the truth. Behind the shine, there are teeth that have devoured entire peoples. The palaces of Nineveh rose like mountains of polished stone. Their doors were adorned with carved lions, symbols of Assyrian power. Within them, wide corridors displayed trophies of war, swords ripped from defeated kings, broken crowns, statues brought from distant lands. It was as if each room were a memorial to violence. Nahum walked before these palaces with firm steps. The city seemed like a cave that had swallowed entire nations. He raised his voice and said, "Where is now the lion's den, the place where they fed their cubs, where the lion and the lioness walked and no one scared them away?" A group of soldiers laughed, but the laughter sounded nervous. "This man dares to mock the king's palace," one of them said. Another, however, murmured, "Or maybe he knows what we fear." In the throne room, officials brought more spoils, fabrics from Phoenicia, gold from Babylon, precious stones from Arabia. Everything was placed before the king as proof of his strength. But among those carrying them were tired eyes, trembling hands, and joyless faces. The lion's roar made the people tremble, Nahum continued, but the roar is hoarse, and the fury has lost its breath. Priests grew restless. Some remembered the times when the palace echoed only with feasts, music, and abundance. Now, though there was still plenty, it seemed empty. It was like wine stored too long, no longer flavorful. "Enough of your words," shouted an advisor. "The king has no need to listen to village prophets." "But the king must listen to the Lord," Nahum replied firmly. The wind, which had previously swept through the walls and marketplaces, blew through the palace windows, lifting curtains and scattering dust over the trophies. Some objects fell to the ground with a crash, as if the wind itself mocked Assyrian glory. A boy, the son of one of the officers, asked in a low voice, "Father, why is the lion's roar faint?" The father didn't answer. He just squeezed his son's hand and looked away, as if afraid to be overheard. Nahum took another step forward. His voice echoed against the golden walls. The lion has torn to pieces for his cubs. He has strangled the prey for the lionesses. He has filled their dens with prey and their caves with plunder. But behold, the Lord is against you. The words fell like a heavy stone. The soldiers, accustomed to victory, felt something they had never known: weakness. Outside, people still milled about in the squares and gardens, but rumors were growing. Some said the roar of Nineveh no longer frightened them as much. Others remembered distant cities that once bowed, but now dared to raise their heads. An old merchant commented sadly, "I've seen a lion hunt. As he grows older, his roars grow fainter and his cubs grow hungry." Nineveh looks like that now. The palace, filled with gold, began to sound hollow. Each footstep on the floor sounded like a drum of emptiness. It was as if the wealth had lost its luster, and the wide corridors echoed only with the memory of past conquests. Silence grew among the guards. Even the torches seemed to burn lower. A young soldier, looking at Nahum with haunted eyes, whispered to his companion, "If the roar is no longer scary, what will come next? The silence that announces the end will come." The silence may announce the end, but the sound of trumpets still echoes throughout the city. Trumpets do not support walls when the Lord has already decreed judgment. In the squares of Nineveh, military rehearsals were a spectacle and a source of pride. War chariots with polished iron wheels paraded in rows, pulled by strong, well-groomed horses. The soldiers, with red shields and raised spears, marched at a steady pace. Trumpets blared loudly, echoing through the wide streets as if to dispel any shadow of fear. "Look," cried a proud citizen, "with such warriors, who will dare touch our city?" The crowds cheered. Children ran after the cars. Women threw flowers in the path of the riders. The sounds of metal, hooves, and trumpets filled the air, as if human strength were enough to ward off any omen. But Nahum, among the crowd, was not deceived. The chariots flash like fire on the day of preparation. The horses stir up their rage, and the soldiers are like ravenous lions. But it will be of no avail when the Lord rises against them. A young soldier, hearing him, replied, "Be silent, prophet. Do you not see that our trumpets are the terror of the nations?" Nahum looked at him firmly and replied, "Trumpets do not drive away judgment. They only echo the emptiness of those who trust in themselves." The wind blew hard, making the flags tremble on their poles. Some looked at each other, remembering the vibration that had once run through walls and gates. There was something strange. The louder the trumpets blared, the more restless their hearts seemed. An old man, leaning on his staff, said in a hoarse voice, "I've seen it before." Armies marching proudly, trumpets blaring loudly, and in the end, everyone was swallowed up by war. The red shields, polished to a gleam in the sun, reflected the light like flames. The people applauded, but some looked fearful. After all, rumors of neighboring peoples rising up against Assyria were already circulating. A priest, standing in the shadow of a pillar, looked away. He knew that the spoils of past wars were the fruit of violence, and that no trumpet could silence the truth now echoing from Nahum's mouth. Suddenly the trumpets blared louder, longer, and higher. The sound filled every street, rattling windows. But instead of courage, many felt a tightness in their chests, as if that sound, rather than protection, was a sign of threat. Nahum raised his voice above the din. "Blow the trumpets, shout loudly. But who will help you when the Lord sets his face against this city?" An uncomfortable silence followed. Even the proud soldiers felt the weight of the words. A young man in the crowd, shaking his mother's hand, asked, "Mom, why am I afraid if the trumpets say we are safe?" She didn't know how to respond. She just hugged him, trying to hide the same doubt that was eating away at her. The trumpets continued, but they brought no relief. The sound seemed to echo in vain, bouncing off the walls and returning as a hollow echo. In the watchtower, one guard muttered to another, It's strange. The more they play, the more I think nothing can save us." The other replied in a low voice, "Maybe it's because there's no help left." The sun was setting, and the orange light reflected off the red shields, making them appear blood-stained. The sight made many uncomfortable, but no one dared speak out. Nahum, with a firm look, concluded before the people, "There is no trumpet that brings help when the city is guilty. The sound you hear today is only the prelude to the silence that will come." The crowd fell silent. Even the soldiers lowered their eyes for a moment. The wind blew again, extinguishing torches and raising dust over the gleaming chariots. A boy with a trembling voice broke the silence. "And when silence comes, who will be left standing? Only those whom the Lord recognizes as his. If only those who belong to the Lord will remain standing, then how will a city that never wanted to listen survive? She will not survive because her walls cannot hold back what comes from the waters. The Tigris River ran broadly before Nineveh. It was a source of life, a trade route, and the pride of the city. Its waters reflected the gleam of the walls, as if confirming the glory of the Assyrian capital. But Nahum, gazing at the heavy flow, saw something others did not, a harbinger of judgment. The rains fell far away, on mountains most had never visited. But each falling drop swelled the river, making its banks stronger and at the same time more dangerous. The dikes, built by Assyrian engineers, creaked under the pressure. A fisherman, looking at the water level, commented to his neighbor, "The river is fuller than usual." "It's just the rainy season," the other replied without concern. But his voice didn't hide his discomfort. Nahum raised his hand, pointing to the waters. "This is what the Lord says. The floodgates will be opened, and the palace will shake." Some laughed, shaking their heads. "How can such a generous river be a threat?" said a merchant. "Because the same river that feeds can also swallow," retorted an old man with a long beard. The guards, perched on the walls, watched the current crashing against the foundations. The sound wasn't just water. It sounded like a deep groan, as if the dikes themselves were suffering. In the throne room, rumors had already reached him. Advisors spoke of reinforcing the river gates, but the king trusted his engineering. "Our men have built walls against the waters as well as against the enemies," he said arrogantly, but Nahum did not keep silent. "The Lord makes a way even in floods. What you call a wall, he calls clay. The wind brought with it the scent of rain, still distant." The people, without realizing it, began to look more closely at the river. Some recalled ancient stories, when unexpected floods swept away entire villages without a trace. A child asked his mother, "Mom, can the river enter the city?" She didn't know what to say. She just squeezed her son's hand and hurried on. The waters pounded, each impact shaking the river gates. Workers checked for cracks, feigning calm. Still, the sound of the levees was a warning. They groaned like wood about to break. Nahum, in a loud voice, declared before everyone, "The river, which should be protection, will be judgment. The doors you proudly call safe will open, and there will be no one to close them." Some soldiers, trying to hide their fear, beat their spears against the ground. "Lies!" they shouted. "Our defenses are unbreakable." But one of them, in a low voice to his companion, murmured, "Then why do I feel like every distant thunder is a warning?" The sky was darkening on the horizon. Although the rain hadn't yet reached the city, lightning illuminated the distant clouds. The people, restless, began to whisper. An elder said in a grave tone, "Don't underestimate the waters. I've seen entire villages disappear overnight. And if the Lord says they will give way, then they will." The sound of military trumpets still echoed in some streets, but now it seemed faint against the roar of the river. With each crash against the banks, it seemed like a response to the city's trials of glory. In the palace tower, an advisor looked down, saw the movement of the waters, and ran to the king. "Your Majesty, we must reinforce the floodgates." The king, irritated, stood up and replied, "Nineveh will not fall by water. We are the fortress of the gods, not a village of peasants." But Nahum raised his voice in the midst of the city and proclaimed, "This is what the Lord says. The floodgates will be opened. The palace will be dissolved, and pride will be swept away by the torrent." The people trembled. Many covered their faces, others clenched their fists, trying to deny it. But the sound of the groaning levees could not be ignored. A young man, looking at the river, his heart racing, asked, "If the waters come in, who will be able to defend us?" "No one, because the Lord himself will open their way." If the Lord himself opens the way for the waters, then what good are our armies? They will be of no use, because the war chariots will become just torches that burn in the night. The wide streets of Nineveh began to echo with the sound of wheels. The iron chariots, the pride of Assyria, were ready. Warriors marched like lightning, racing back and forth, sharpening spears, adjusting shields. The sun reflected off the bronze, sparks flashing with each movement. The generals shouted orders, trying to enforce discipline, but their haste betrayed their faces. With each beat of the wheels, the feeling was that the city was running not to win, but to escape what was already coming. Nahum raised his voice above the noise. "The cars rage in the streets. They race. Through the squares they look like torches, like lightning they jump from one side to the other." A young warrior, panting, heard and laughed disdainfully. "Better for us, prophet. We will be like lightning against our enemies." Nahum, without looking away, replied, "No, boy. You will not be flashes of victory, but of panic." The wheels sparked against the stone. People watched from their balconies, trying to convince themselves that this display was a sign of strength. But the faster the chariots sped, the more disorderly. They seemed crashing into each other, scattering sparks into the air. An old man murmured, "I see more desperation than strategy." The trumpets sounded again, but this time they lacked the same majesty. They sounded like cries for help masquerading as commands. At the gates, the carts jostled for space, pushing and shoving, iron grinding against iron. The friction sent sparks flying, illuminating the horses' tense eyes. In the watchtower, one guard said to another, "I've never seen our warriors in such a hurry." "Neither do I," replied his companion. "It seems they run more from fear than from courage." Nahum took a step forward and declared, "When the Lord blows, even the strongest chariots become consumed torches. What shines today will be ashes tomorrow." The wind blew through the streets, kicking up dust. The sparks from the cars seemed to multiply, like embers about to set the city itself ablaze. A woman, hugging her daughter, said in a low voice, "It seems the fire has already started, even before the battle." In the palace, the advisors shouted instructions, but the sound of the wheels drowned out their voices. The king watched uneasily from his window. "Why such a hurry?" he murmured. "Where is the discipline that always gave us victory?" Nahum, in a solemn tone, spoke, "Haste is the sign of downfall. When cars race aimlessly, it's because the city has already lost its way. The streets, once orderly, were now the scene of clashes. Cars passed each other in disarray. Warriors shouted, horses neighed. What was supposed to be a display of power turned into chaos. A young soldier, his face covered in sweat, looked at his companion and asked, "Are we ready for war? Or are we already running away from it?" The other's silence was answer enough. The sparks on the ground grew louder, and each crash of wheels seemed to herald fire. The people, once confident, began to cower in doorways and alleys, fearing that the streets themselves would catch fire from so many sparks. Nahum raised his hand and shouted, "Behold the city that trusted in its chariots. Behold the people who boasted of their speed. But all you see now is not strength, but terror." The words echoed like a hammer in the hearts of the listeners. A child, looking at the scattering sparks, asked in a trembling voice, "Mom, if the cars become torches, what will become of us? We will only be witnesses to the fire that the Lord has already kindled against this city." So the fire is already lit against this city? Yes, but before he consumes everything, the walls will show their wounds. Dawn brought a different kind of activity to Nineveh. Masons were called in hurriedly. Men carried new stones, cauldrons steamed with pitch, chains dragged heavy blocks. The sound of hammers echoed off the walls, as if each blow were a desperate attempt to hide the inevitable. At the North Tower, the engineers pointed with trembling fingers. Small lines marked the wall, thin, almost invisible cracks. But to those familiar with the structure, these were serious signs. A bricklayer muttered to his colleague, "It seems like nothing, but I know that each scratch is a scream trapped in the stone." "Then why do we cover it with tar and lime?" the other replied. "That only hides it, it doesn't cure it." Nahum walked the streets, watching men and women carrying stones running through the dust. His voice rose above the sound of the chains. "Look, they try to patch up what the Lord has already marked to fall." Some stopped their work for a moment, but soon the supervisors shouted orders, forcing them to continue. A sweating soldier asked in a harsh tone, "Prophet, don't you see that we are defending our city?" "Yes, I see," Nahum replied. "But I also see that it is not your arms that hold up walls, but the breath of God. When he takes his breath away, even stones are split." People whispered. Many, looking closely, noticed the lines growing wider. What had seemed like a mere line in the morning was now wider by the afternoon. The masons hurried, filling cauldrons with pitch, pouring the black mixture over the marks. But the wind quickly dried them, revealing the cracks once again. A woman carrying water sighed. It's like trying to heal a deep wound with a dirty cloth. In the East Tower, a guard called out in despair, "Here!" Another crack. The engineers rushed forward, bringing chains to hold the blocks in place. The chains clinked, but the sound was more like lamentation than strength. Nahum raised his hand, pointing upwards. "The cracks aren't just in the stones. They're in the heart of this city. When guilt grows, the weight breaks the foundations." Silence fell for a moment. Even the tired bricklayers dropped their tools to listen. An old builder with a white beard muttered sadly, "I worked on these walls when I was young. I never thought I'd see lines multiply like this. It's as if the stones were tired of bearing so much arrogance." Nahum answered firmly, "It's not stone-cold tiredness. It's God's judgment." The sun beat down, and each crack seemed to shine like an exposed scar. The repairs couldn't keep up with the speed of the new cracks. The more they filled, the more new ones appeared. The king, informed of the situation, ordered reinforcements, more masons, more materials, more chains. "Don't let the walls show weakness," he shouted. But on the streets, people were beginning to realize the truth. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you squeezed, the more it ran out. A boy pulled his father's arm and said, "Dad, why does the wall look sick?" The father didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the line that now ran like an open vein through the stone. The wind blew hard, kicking up dust and making the scaffolding creak. The pitch cauldron shook. A crack cracked loudly like suppressed thunder. The sound rippled through the walls, chilling even the hardest hearts. Nahum raised his voice one last time. "See, the lines want to be cracks, and the cracks want to be a fall. So will your pride be broken before the Lord." A profound silence fell over the square. Even the hammers stopped. A young worker with pitch-black hands looked up and asked in a low voice, "And when the walls fall, who will be left to protect us?" "No one, because the Lord himself tears down what man insists on sustaining." If the Lord himself tears down what man insists on sustaining, then what good will our riches be? They will be of no use, because gold cannot fill cracks, nor can fabric hold up walls. The Nineveh market, always a spectacle of color and smell, was strange that morning. Stalls crammed with fine fabrics from Phoenicia, spices from Arabia, gold from Babylon, rare stones from India. The scent of incense mingled with the smell of sweat, but something hung heavy in the air: fear. Merchants spoke more quietly than usual as they hid coins in small bags, trying to calculate escape routes. Porters hurried between stalls, not with goods, but with news of cracks in the walls, of cars in disarray, of rising waters. Nahum walked between the tents. His voice rose, cutting through the murmur. "See, the market is full of gold, but empty of peace. You store spices, but you have no rest. What good is treasure if heaven has already decreed silence over your gods?" A merchant shouted nervously, "Shut up, prophet! Can't you see that the people are already scared?" "That is precisely why I speak," Nahum replied, "so that you may know that it is not the enemy who terrifies you, but the hand of the Lord that is heavy upon you." People looked at each other. Women tucked rings into their veils. Men wrapped coins in belts. Children tugged at their parents, unsure of what the rush was all about. A young man asked, "If the Lord is upon us, then why don't we cry out to our gods? They have always given us victory." The silence was heavy. Even the priests milling about the market lowered their eyes. For though there were altars and images on every corner, none of them responded. An old woman in a weak voice murmured, "I have cried out to them so many times, and have always received only silence." Her words spread like wind. The people began to ask loudly, "Where are the gods of Assyria?" "Why don't you answer now? If they are strong, why do they let the cracks grow?" Nahum raised his hand and said firmly, "Because there is no voice in them. They are only stone and wood. Heaven answers with silence because the Lord has already decided." A merchant, his face pale, dropped coins on the ground. No one rushed to pick them up. The gold seemed worthless against the weight of fear. The sound of trumpets still echoed in the distance, mixed with the rumble of wheels, but in the marketplace it no longer inspired confidence. The people saw in the haste of the soldiers and the silence of the priests proof that something greater was happening. A child looked up and asked his mother, "Mom, if the gods don't answer, who will listen to us?" The mother couldn't answer. She held her son tightly in her arms and wept silently. Nahum, walking among them, declared, "The Lord sees even what is hidden in bags of coins. He weighs not only the gold, but also the intentions. And he has already found this city wanting." The merchants stirred. Some tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The streets were full of voices, but none of them brought hope. A priest, pressured by the people, tried to raise his voice before a bronze idol. "Great God of war, answer your people." The entire market fell silent for a moment, waiting for some signal, but nothing happened. Only the sound of the wind kicking up dust and the distant sound of water lapping against the walls. The people began to shout in despair, "He doesn't talk! He doesn't listen! We are alone!" The silence of the heavens was more deafening than any trumpet. Nahum raised his voice one last time. "Woe to the city that trusts in mute gods! Woe to the people who place their lives in riches that cannot save." A young man, trembling, grabbed his neighbor's arm and asked with tears in his eyes, "If the gods do not answer, who will answer us now?" "The Lord will answer, but not with help, but with judgment." If the Lord answers with judgment, then how will the mighty continue to celebrate? They will try to drink, but the wine will escape from their cup. In the heart of Nineveh, the nobles gathered to show that nothing could shake the great city. The palace glowed with torches hung from marble columns. Embroidered carpets covered the floor, and lavish tables were spread before the guests. There was roast meat, fresh-baked bread, jugs of wine, and bowls of fruit. The officers and advisers raised their glasses, laughing loudly, as if they could silence the rumors of cracks, water, and fear. The king, in golden robes, stood before them all. "See, Nineveh stands firm. As we drink, we show the world that our strength does not waver." The guests applauded, raising their glasses. The sound of metal and crystal echoed like a false victory, but Nahum stood at the door. His voice did not ask permission, but thundered into the music, "Woe to the bloodthirsty city! Woe to the house that is filled with banquets while its foundations already groan." Some laughed, trying to stifle their discomfort. One counselor, his mouth stained with wine, shouted, "What does it matter what a prophet says? The wine is sweet, the meat is plentiful, and the people serve us." Nahum answered firmly, "But the Lord weighs the bowls, and there will come no joy from them but trembling." Silence fell for a moment. Soon, musicians resumed their music and the nobles laughed again, albeit forcedly. But then the ground shook slightly. Wine ran over the rims of the glasses, staining fingers and tunics. A nobleman, frightened, tried to laugh. "It's just the weight of the party." But the tremor returned, stronger. Glasses fell shattering on the marble. The spilled wine ran down the steps like a red thread, reminiscent of blood. A young servant, terrified, whispered, "It seems that the earth itself cannot handle this party." The king, irritated, stood up. "No one interrupts Nineveh's banquet. Play louder, drink even more. Show that nothing can shake us." But another tremor shook the palace. The jugs toppled, spilling wine in a cascade across the table. The liquid ran across the floor and down the marble stairs like a crimson river. The eyes of those present widened. No one dared laugh. Nahum, in a solemn voice, declared, "Here is the sign. The wine you spill is not a celebration, it is a premonition. The blood of the people you devoured now flows before you." A counselor, trembling, dropped the cup. "Prophet, is this the end?" Nahum didn't answer right away. The silence was filled only by the dripping of wine staining the stones. The women backed away, pulling up their dresses to avoid soiling themselves. The musicians lowered their instruments, unable to play against the tremors. The banquet, designed to assert power, became a scene of fear. A servant holding a fallen tray murmured, "Even wine abandons us." The king, still standing, tried to hide his nervousness. But the red running down the steps seemed to mock his authority. Nahum then spoke once more. "The Lord breaks the banquets of the proud. For when the earth trembles, no table can stand firm." The nobles looked at each other. Some dropped their glasses, others tried to flee discreetly. But everyone knew something bigger was coming. A young servant, wide-eyed, asked in a low voice, "If even the king's banquet can be interrupted, what will be left of the city? Only the silence of judgment will remain, which no one will be able to swallow." If not even the king's banquet could continue, what will happen when the river decides to rise? Then the whole city will prove that water can be more terrible than any army. The Tigris, silent and wide, seemed to watch the city with vengeful eyes. Its waters, swollen by distant rains, lapped against the walls as if begging for passage. The people, restless, stopped on the banks to watch. What had once been a source of pride was now a source of fear. In the South Tower, guards watched the floodgates. Iron chains held together immense doors that protected the river entrance. But the cracks were already damp, and each drip seemed to reveal a dangerous secret. A fisherman, pointing to the walls, muttered, "Look, the water has already found its way." Another replied nervously, "It's just infiltration. Nothing more." But his look belied his words. Nahum stood before the people and proclaimed, "The Lord is against you, Nineveh. The gates of the river will be opened, and your palaces will dissolve like clay in a flood." Some laughed, trying to stifle their fear. A merchant shouted, "Lies! Our river feeds us, it doesn't destroy us." Nahum answered, "He who gave waters to nourish can also use them to punish. The wind brought the scent of rain, though still distant. The current pounded harder, and the dikes groaned. The masons, already tired of filling cracks, rushed in with cauldrons of tar, but the effort seemed futile. A woman with a baby in her arms asked softly, "If the river comes in, where will we run to?" No one knew how to answer. In the tower, an engineer shouted, "More chains! Reinforce the doors!" Men ran, dragging iron and stone, but the pressure of the water seemed to mock their every effort. Nahum raised his voice above the noise of the river. "Don't you see? The Lord blows on the waters. They are his army marching against you." People crowded the banks, watching the water rise. Small cracks became dark lines, and the lines wanted to become open cracks. A young guardian, his hand trembling on his spear, asked his companion, "What if I give in?" The other swallowed hard and replied, "Then there will be no wall to protect us." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed. Part of the dike gave way, sending water crashing against the gates. The chain rose like a hungry animal, banging loudly. The iron chains rattled, the gates creaked. At the palace, the king was informed. "Your Majesty, the river is pressing. The gates will not hold." But the king, furious, shouted, "Reinforce! Nothing enters Nineveh without my order." Meanwhile, Nahum declared before the crowd, "The order is not yours, O king. It is the Lord's. And he has already decreed, the floodgates will open." Another roar shook the walls. An entire section trembled. The ground vibrated, and the people fell to their knees. Then in an instant the water found its way. First one jet, then another, until the entire river seemed to bite into the foundations. The river's gates opened with a long moan, like a death cry. The current surged in, sweeping away rocks, breaking walls, and sweeping away houses near the banks. Terror gripped the city. A boy, clinging to his father's arm, cried, "Dad, the river has entered the city. What will become of us?" And the father, looking at the chaos, replied in a low, almost breathless voice, "Now, son, the enemy has a clear path to enter." So the enemy already has a clear path to enter. Yes, and now the waters don't come alone. Fire also walks the streets. Night fell upon Nineveh, but it brought no rest. Instead of silence came a roar. Instead of peace came a flash. Warehouses began to burn, first one, then another, until the fire illuminated the city's wide avenues. The flames licked at wooden doors, crept up the brick walls, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Screams echoed everywhere. Women ran with children. Soldiers stumbled amid the smoke. The commanders shouted orders, but the confusion was louder than their voices. "Protect the wheat stores!" "No, defend the gates!" "Run to the palace!" The instructions contradicted each other. One group ran to the right, another to the left. What had been discipline dissolved into chaos. Nahum, in the midst of the fiery red night, raised his voice. "This is the judgment of the Lord. What you treasured for your pride is now consumed before your eyes." A soldier coughing from the smoke shouted, "Cursed be you, prophet! You brought this fire upon us." Nahum answered firmly, "It was not I who lit it. It was the Lord who blew on the coals of your guilt." People tried to carry goods, but soon abandoned everything, preferring to save their own lives. Gold and silver fell into the streets, forgotten amid the flames. A desperate merchant cried in front of his burning warehouse. It was years of work. Everything burned in a single night. A neighbor replied, "Don't you see? It's the end. It's not just a fire. It's judgment." Smoke rose like a dark column against the sky. The shadows of the flames cast frightening figures on the walls. It seemed as if the city itself was being devoured by fiery creatures. The guards tried to organize lines, but were pushed back by the crowd. Children screamed, old men fell to the ground, and women begged for help. In the tower, a commander shouted to the archers, "Launch fire arrows at the enemy!" But another, in panic, replied, "The fire is already in the avenues. Why fight?" Nahum declared in a deep voice, "See how fire needs neither bow nor sword. It runs through the streets like an invisible army, and no one can stop it." Every moment a new explosion. An oil warehouse caught fire, sending up flames that lit the sky like a red dawn. The heat burned even the skin of those in the distance. A young man covered in ash grabbed his father's arm. "Dad, the city is falling apart!" The father replied with tears in his eyes, "Yes, son. The city that boasted of strength now surrenders to its own fear. The palace, too, began to feel the heat. Its gilded corridors became tunnels of smoke. The nobles, who had once drunk at banquets, now ran like terrified servants. Nahum, with his eyes fixed on the flames, proclaimed, "When the Lord decides, even fire becomes his messenger." And Nineveh, which burned other nations, now feels the taste of fire within itself. The sound of military trumpets still tried to sound, but it was mixed with the crackling of the flames. No order seemed firm. No command brought safety. A woman carrying 2 children by the hand cried out in despair, "Where will we go? There is no street without fire." And an old man lying on the ground answered in a weak voice, "Now there is nowhere to go, because the fire has taken over the city, and there is still the sword that comes after it. If after the fire comes the sword, who will protect the king? No one, because even the throne will lose its strength before the judgment. The royal chamber of Nineveh, once filled with voices and protocol, was now nearly empty. The high ceiling still supported heavy curtains, but smoke from the streets seeped in through the windows, staining the fabrics with a burnt smell. The floor, once reflecting the light of gold and silver, was now covered in dust and wind-blown ash. In the center, the golden throne remained, but alone. Beside it, the king's scepter lay on the floor, as if hastily abandoned. On the royal table, half-burned maps crumbled to ash, showing lines of conquered territories that were now nothing but dust. Nahum entered through the wide gate and looked around. Behold the throne that boasted of ruling nations. Where are those who obeyed its orders now? A servant, hidden behind a column, came out with timid steps. They fled, prophet, generals, counselors, priests. Each one ran for his life. "And the king?" asked Nahum. "He is locked in his quarters, surrounded only by fear." The echo in the room was eerie. Before, every royal order had resounded like thunder. Now all that remained was the sound of wind rattling the windows and the rustling of falling ash. Nahum picked up the fallen scepter, held it for a moment, and let it fall back to the ground. The metallic sound echoed cold like a sentence. Human power is like that, heavy when it rises, empty when it falls. A soldier ran in, unaware of the prophet's presence. "Lord," he shouted to the empty throne, "we need orders. The people are fleeing, the enemy is advancing, the fire is unceasing. Tell us what to do." But no one answered. The throne, silent, only reflected its own impotence. The soldier fell to his knees, crying, "There is no more voice, there is no more command. We are left to chance." Nahum approached him. "It is not chance, soldier. It is judgment. He who reigns over all thrones has already decided, and no voice can be raised against him." The walls of the room seemed to groan. Every torchlight flickered, as if mocking the lost glory. Where there had once been pride, there was now emptiness. An old man, who had served his entire life in the palace, entered, leaning on a staff. He looked around and sighed. "I served 3 kings in this room. I saw feasts, I saw victories. Now I see only dust. Who would have thought that the throne of Nineveh would end like this?" Nahum answered, "Every throne that rises without justice ends in the dust." The old man nodded, tears in his eyes. "So there will be nothing left. The bitter memory will remain, that the Lord will not be mocked." Suddenly, a loud crash shook the palace. Pieces of the ceiling fell, scattering ash across the floor. The soldier looked at the throne in terror and shouted, "Even the stones want to fall." The echo of the scream spread empty, unanswered. The silence of the royal chamber was louder than any order from the king. Nahum raised his voice, firm as a hammer. Where there were orders, now only echoes remain. Where there was power, now there is only dust. A young servant hidden behind the curtain came out and asked in a choked voice, "And when even the throne is swept away by the dust, what will become of us? All that remains is to face the king who never loses his throne. If the king who never loses his throne is standing, then what will remain of the lion's den? Only silence will remain, for the den that roared over the nations is now in ruins. The streets of Nineveh woke up covered in ash. The previous night's fire still smoked from some warehouses. The people walked with their heads down, stumbling over broken stones, staring fearfully at each cracked wall. The city, which once boasted of being a den of lions, now seemed but a shadow. Nahum walked through the squares, and his voice echoed firmly, "Where is now the lion's den, where they fed their cubs? Where are the claws that tore people apart?" No one answered. The claws were there, but rusted. Swords and spears lying on the ground no longer gleamed in the sun. Some were stained with rust, others were broken. The warriors who once boasted of their strength now hid behind closed doors. An old man, sitting on a stone, murmured, "I've seen soldiers from this city return covered in glory, bringing spoils and prisoners. Now I see only dust where there was once pride." Nahum answered, "For the roaring is no more. The lion has grown old, and the Lord has taken away the breath from his mouth." The women, upon hearing this, wept softly. Children asked innocently, "Mom, where are the roaring lions?" And the mother, with teary eyes, replied, "They don't roar anymore, son. The den is empty. The palace, which had once seemed indestructible, had broken windows, dust-filled corridors, and burned tapestries. The columns that supported its strength were stained with smoke. A guard, leaning on his spear, whispered to his companion, "Do you still hear their roar at night?" "No," replied the other. "Now I only hear silence." Nahum raised his voice before the assembled people. "The Lord has turned the den into a desert. The place that devoured nations will no longer be known among men. Your enemies will no longer hear a roar, only oblivion." A young merchant, desperate, tried to oppose. "No, Nineveh cannot end. There will always be a memory of our strength." The prophet replied, "The city learns its new name today, Oblivion." The words fell like stones on the hearts of the listeners. It was hard to believe that the capital that once dominated the world could be forgotten. But the weight of defeat was already visible in the people's eyes. A soldier dropped his sword and said in a low voice, "We have no more strength, no more roar. What is left of us?" The wind blew through the streets, stirring dust over the lions carved into the palace walls. Once symbols of pride, they now seemed nothing more than silent statues covered in soot. The children looked and asked, "Who will defend us now?" And no one had an answer. Nahum declared, "The Lord gives voice to the kingdoms. When he is silent, no one cries out. When he extinguishes, no one remembers." The silence was heavy. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned the squares. An old priest who had once offered sacrifices in the temples looked up at the ruins and murmured, "So, this is the end." "Oblivion," Nahum answered firmly. "Yes, because the Lord brings down the proud and exalts only his own glory." The flames no longer burned as before, but the smoke rising from the ruins still reminded the people that the city was burning from within. A young woman, hugging her daughter, asked in tears, "And when everything is forgotten, who will say that we once existed?" "The Lord will say, but not as a reminder of glory, but as an eternal warning." So eternal warning will be our inheritance? Yes, because there are wounds that the Lord does not allow to heal, so that everyone may learn the weight of justice. In Nineveh's central square, there was no longer any celebration or commerce. What remained was smoldering rubble, burned doors and cracked walls. The dust of destruction hung in the air like a thick fog, making breathing heavy. The once proud people walked aimlessly, Staring at the ground as if searching for a non-existent exit, Nahum stood before the survivors, and his voice rang out clearly, "Thus says the Lord, your wound is incurable, your wound is fatal." The words fell like blades. No one dared laugh, no one mocked. The silence was heavy, broken only by low cries. A man with ash-stained hands asked, "But is there no remedy? Will there be no forgiveness for this city?" Nahum answered, "There was forgiveness in the time of Jonah, when the city humbled itself. But today its heart is hardened. You did not cry out, you only laughed. Now the wound is incurable." The women wept, remembering their sons taken to war. The men, once strong warriors, lay broken like shadows of their former selves. An old man, his voice breaking, murmured, "So all effort was in vain. Our walls, our riches, our gods, all empty." Nahum answered firmly, "Yes, because no one can mock God. He weighs in the scales, and when he finds them empty, he casts down the proud." Outside the city, people who had previously suffered from Assyria's cruelty began to rejoice. Messengers ran, announcing the fall of Nineveh. A foreigner who had lost his family at the hands of the Assyrians raised his voice. "Now justice has been served. The whip that wounded us has been broken." News spread like wildfire. Neighboring peoples clapped their hands, celebrating not Nineveh's grief, but the justice that had finally reached the arrogant Nahum, looking up to the heavens, declared, "All who have heard of your wickedness now applaud you. For upon whom has your cruelty not continually passed?" The remaining soldiers dropped their weapons. Some fell to their knees, others simply fled. The palace, empty, no longer offered shelter. A young man with a lost look in his eyes asked his father, "Why doesn't the Lord heal us like he did before?" And the father answered in tears, "Because this time there was no regret left in us." The words echoed among the few who listened. Every corner of the city seemed to shout the same thing, the end. Nahum then raised his hands and said in a firm voice, "This is the verdict. Your wound will not heal. Your sore will not be healed. The Lord has risen against you, and your memory will be dust." The flames still burned in some places, illuminating weary faces. Children cried, old people mourned, but there was no promise of restoration. The wind blew through the empty streets, scattering ash like someone sealing a tomb. And in everyone's minds echoed the certainty. The city that once dominated the world was now nothing but ruins. A servant, his gaze fixed on the ground, muttered in a low voice, "If the wound has no cure, what is left for us? All that remains is to wait for the day when everyone will see that the Lord is just." The memory of Nineveh is not merely a landmark of ruins in time, but a beacon of warning to all who choose injustice over righteousness. The city did not fall for lack of wealth or armies, but because its greatness was built on foundations of pride, violence, and cruelty. When judgment came, there was no wall to support it, no altar to appease it. Nahum's prophecy was fully fulfilled, and its voice still echoes beyond the dust of centuries. It speaks to us today, reminding us that power, fame, or position do not shield anyone from the truth. God's justice may seem slow, but it never fails, and it always reaches those who insist on walking against it. How often do we delude ourselves like Nineveh, thinking that our actions will have no consequences? How often do we ignore warnings, close our ears, and seek refuge in fleeting things, forgetting that only truth is eternal? The city's fall reminds us that human glory is as brief as the breath of the wind, but divine judgment is certain. However, it also points the way. If arrogance leads to ruin, humility opens doors of hope. May we learn before it is too late not to repeat the steps of Nineveh. May our lives be built on righteousness and truth, not on pride and deceit. For cities rise and fall, kingdoms rise and disappear, but the word and righteousness of the Lord endure forever. If this story spoke to your heart, 2 other videos will appear on your screen featuring prophets who also witnessed God's judgment and mercy. Click, subscribe to the channel and like. May the God who shook the gates of Nineveh and raised the banner of eternal justice speak to you too. Because sometimes the greatest revelation only comes when we realize that no human strength can withstand the Lord.